Hello, welcome. Uh, Today is our fifth presentation on Answer to Job. And before I begin that, I want to go ahead and read a portion of a letter that Dr. Jung wrote to Dr. Bernard Martin on December 7th, 1954. And this will put Dr. Jung's work in a little bit more context with respect to these religious matters. And he speaks directly in this about Answer to Job. So, you know of that which is beyond the psyche only through belief, not through knowledge. I do not write for believers who already possess the whole truth, rather for unbelieving but intelligent people who want to understand something. Without the psyche, you can neither know nor believe. Therefore, everything about which we can speak at all lies in the psychic realm. Even the atom is in this sense a psychic model. Hi, Miles. Welcome. I grant you that the believer will learn nothing from my Answer to Job, since he already has everything. I write only for unbelievers. Thanks to your belief, you know much more than I do. Since my earliest youth, I have been made to feel how rich and how knowing the believers are, and how disinclined even to listen to anything else. I do not hesitate to admit my extreme poverty in knowing through believing, and would therefore advise you to shut my book with a bang and inscribe in the inside cover, "Nothing here for the believing Christian," a sentiment with which I am in complete agreement. I am not concerned with what is believable, but simply what is knowable. It seems to me that we are not in a position to generate or uphold belief, for belief is a charisma which God giveth or taketh away. It would be presumptuous to imagine that we can command it at will. For the sake of brevity, my comments are rather direct and outspoken. I hope you won't mind this, but we'll see how different are the two planes on which the discussion is moving. Without in any way impugning belief, I confine myself to its assertions. As you see, I even take the highly controversial new dogma at its face value. I do not consider myself competent to judge the metaphysical truth of these assertions. I only try to elucidate their content and their psychological associations. The assertions are, as you yourself admit, anthropomorphic, and therefore can hardly be considered reliable with respect to their metaphysical truth. You, as a believer, take the stand that the proposition God is has as its inevitable corollary God's existence in reality, whereas Kant irrefutably pointed out long ago in Critique of St. Anselm's Proof of God that the little word is can denote no more than a copula in the judgment. Other religions make equally absolute assertions, but quite different ones. But as a psychologist on the one hand and a human being on the other, I must acknowledge that my brother may be right too. I do not belong to the elect and the Latin and the beati possidente of the sole truth, but must give fair consideration to all human assertions, even the denial of God. So when you confront me as a Christian apologist, You are standing on a different plane from me. You cling to believing is knowing, and I must always be the loser because de fide non est disputatum. Any more... let's see if that has a translation. One cannot argue about faith. So, and I must always be the loser because one cannot argue about faith. And more than one cannot argue about faith any more than one can argue about taste. One cannot argue with the possessor of the truth. Only the seeker after truth needs to reflect, to inquire, to deliberate, for he admits that he does not know. As a believer, you can only dismiss me out of hand and declare that I am no Christian, and what I say is useless, indeed harmful. Well, gunpowder was a dangerous invention, but it also has its useful applications. It is notorious that everything can be used for a good or a bad purpose. Hence, there was no valid reason for me to keep silent, quite apart from the fact that the present state of Christendom arouses a host of doubts in people's minds. As a doctor, I have to provide the answers which for many of my patients are not forthcoming from the theologian. I myself have politely requested the theologians to explain to me what the attitude of modern Protestantism is as regard the entity of the Old and the New Testament concept of God. 2 didn't answer at all, and the 3rd said that nobody bothers anymore about God concepts nowadays. But for the religious-minded person, this is a matter of burning interest, which was one of my motives for writing Answer to Job. I would like to recommend Professor Volz's German name to your attention, and as for the New Testament, I posed the question, is it necessary to placate a loving father with the martyr's death of his son? What is the relation here between love and vindictiveness, and what would I feel about it if my own father exhibited that kind of phenomenology? Such are the questions of the unbelieving religious man for whom I write. To him applies the amiable pedestrian principle of Matthew 13:12. Whosoever hath, to him shall be given, etc. Sorry, I'm translating another Latin. But to them it is not given. Those lost sheep, of which another equally authentic logion says that Christ was sent only to them. Those who cannot believe would at least like to understand. Understandest thou what thou readest? Acts 8:30. But understanding begins at the bottom of the mountain on top of which the believer sits. He already knows everything much better and can therefore say, Lord, I thank thee that I am not so dumb and ignorant as those down below who want to understand. Luke 18:11. I cannot anticipate a thing by believing it, but must be content with my unbelief until my efforts meet with the grace of illumination, that is, with religious experience. I cannot make believe. To conclude with an indiscreet question, don't you think the angel of the Lord wrestling with Jacob also got a few hefty cuffs and kicks? So much for my scandalous criticism of Yahweh. I know my answer to Job is a shocker for which I ought to offer a civil apology. Hence my motto. Yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. Okay, so that's a beginning. And let's see. Hello, Greg. Welcome. So now we can go back to this Edinger's 9 points on these. Let's see, how am I going to make this bigger? I think I can do it. I want to make it so you can read the 9 points and also have me in the screen. So here I am, and here are the 9 points. Let's see. Miles says, a local indigenous man at a meeting says that he asks people to think rather than believe. I appreciate this distinction more now. And then he says, it is a great day for me when I realize that Jungian theory brings empiricism to the spiritual. Right. And so, anyway, in my opinion, and this is opinion only, Dr. Jung demonstrated where God lives. And so anyway, going back to Dr. Edinger's points, point number 1, the chosen people, the Jews, were burdened with a heavy obligation. He says this is really a central theme of individuation. Each of us is chosen to be the will of God. In Islam, they say, Inshallah, if God wills it, which amounts to a prayer to the collective unconscious. Until this point, people were seen as collective individual. But with Job is born the idea of the individual. And so one who steps out of the anonymity of the cycle of nature and into a personal, unique fate. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about individuation. Because the Jews were oppressed by great kingdoms all around them, Israel was prepared to follow an inner way. Israel could make room for itself only inwardly, and was thereby peculiarly suited to take upon itself the misery and dignity, the curse and blessing of God's election. They were God's easiest prey. To be chosen is often experienced psychologically within individuals as having been the easiest prey. It doesn't come out of a state of fullness, it comes out of a state of emptiness. Became uniquely chose to incarnate the self. And I made the comment here, I did this note quite a while ago. One of my frustrations with a rabbi friend is that when he thinks of the chosen, he says it in such a way that I infer that he means that others cannot get there and experience God. That is, achieve individuation of the self. This is one of the great mistakes that cause men and women to die even today. All of us are capable of individuation and thereby to carry the responsibility of God, of making godlike decisions, of choosing for the good. This does not depend on any given creed, but God's covenant with Noah and David is broken. And you can see David's complaints in the 89th Psalm, the Babylon captivity. It was Yahweh after all. Try reasoning with a newborn baby who is all Yahweh. So what I would observe is that when babies are born, they're like little kings and queens, and all their needs are fulfilled. But gradually they have to mature and understand what their limits are. And I think that's part of the point. But another part of the point was that at the time of chosenness, for the Israelites, the Jews, there were 100 million people on the planet, and there were others who were also making religious discoveries. I mean, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, lived about the same time as Job did. And so, what I find irritating is when my rabbi friend tells me that, I'm a Gentile and therefore not chosen. Who's doing this choosing? And, I think we have to understand that it's the human being that's chosen. So that's point number one. But keep in mind also that in Jungian psychology, the way people open to individuation is by a defeat. This is the point of the Job archetype, and it permeates everything in Dr. Jung's oeuvre. In other words, nobody goes to a Jungian analyst unless they're in trouble. And so we have to learn what assets we have in our psyche to heal. And so the Job archetype is contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. And it's very interesting, as some of you probably know, I've been reading this book by Lawrence Jaffe. I've left it in the other room right now, but Jaffe points out that rebirth is something like the Christian idea of birth to the Virgin, which is a metaphor in this case. He's talking about it metaphorically. And he says that in our psyche, in our very deep psyche, we always have some part of us that can be reborn, or can be born anew, and with a sort of sense of optimism. In other words, no matter how bad things get and how defeated we feel, after we lament for a period of time, there's a little part of us that can always be reborn into a new life. And I can offer personal testimony to that, because I've had the proverbial 9 lives, and I've done more things in various decades of my life that most people do in a lifetime. And so I know that I can reinvent myself almost no matter what happens to me in my life. So let's see. So individuation makes whistleblowers out of some of us, not typically a materially beneficial proposition. Yeah, that may be true to a certain extent. Greg says, is the rabbi acting out of inflated ego or a weak ego? Well, honestly, Yates, I have to tell you, I'm sorry, honestly, Gray, I have to tell you that my reaction is that he has lived a rather sheltered life. This is a man who is very impressive he has a very impressive resume as a rabbi. Among other things, his father was abused during Kristallnacht in 1936 or 38 when the Nazis came through Germany and broke all the glass. And he managed to escape Germany before the war really began, fortunately for my friend. And he was a fraternity brother of mine in college, so we were going to school side by side. And over the years, I have been very impressed by some of his thinking. And among other things, he is the past president of the World Union of Progressive Jews, which has something like 1.4 million members. So he's quite an impressive guy. But when I've been close to him, I've realized that he's basically telling the story as it was told him in divinity school or wherever, and he hasn't really looked outside that perspective. And he's probably done a fine job in terms of dealing with a congregation and the kinds of issues that a rabbi would have. Typically marital problems and that sort of thing come up for rabbis as well as psychologists. But outside of the individual congregation, he doesn't seem to have very much life experience. And so he just doesn't want to think about these other ideas much. But in fairness, he wrote a book called "What's in It for Me?" ? Finding Ourselves in Biblical Narratives, which I thought was a brilliant book. It's really good. And as a matter of fact, I have published it in its entirety on a separate website that I maintain. I can give you that link, and you can go look at it. And it's let me see if I can find it very quickly for you rather than send it to you here, because okay, so here is the book, and the nice thing is my rabbi friend says that you can read it for free, and so I think that that's very good, and in many ways it's a very Jungian book because it's putting biblical stories in a modern context, which I appreciate very much. For example, when he's talking about Genesis, and much of it is about the Torah, he says, Genesis is not a book about science. It's a book about it's a metaphor for the birth of humanity and the birth of human thinking. So, I mean, in that way, I have a lot of respect for him for writing that book and for being a progressive so-called Jew. But nonetheless, some of these ideas, like the idea of the chosen, do come through, and they come through with a certain arrogance that I don't think is useful to us on a world that has 7.5 billion people in it. But that's just my personal opinion. So anyway, So, in terms of whether my rabbi friend has a weak ego and too weak to face individuation, I think that might be a fair um, assessment. I know that I've sent him some of Edinger's work, and as far as I know, he hasn't read it. He's never talked to me about it, and so, and mind you, me and another classmate uh, are two people that wrote glowing recommendations for him so that he would be named alumnus of the year at his divinity school. Or actually, it was at his Master's of Divinity School, which he did win. So I'm a great supporter of his in the theologian silo. Let's say it that way. But I don't think at his age, he's the same age as I am, and I'm 71. I don't think he feels that he can go back and reassess all of his thinking going back through his lifetime very easily. And I've had to reassess all along the way, so that's why I'm much more open to Dr. Jung's ideas. So Grace says, Miles says, the Jews were chosen for a particular role in the history of the planet. That much is true, doesn't make them more important, just unique like others are unique. Well, I think that that's fair enough. I mean, they did keep their scriptures, and they kept them for thousands of years, and not so many others did that. Of course, if you go over to Buddhism, you'll find that there are 84,000 teachings of the Buddha. Only 5% of them have so far been translated into English. And they too have been maintained since about the same time as Job. Now, Jewish scriptures go back much farther than that, of course, at least 1,000 years earlier. And obviously there were Egyptian scriptures even before then. And so people have been doing things, but for the Western world, for Western Europe, and what we call the West today, the Jewish scriptures have turned out to be the most valuable. I see my hair is a little askew here. When my wife isn't around, I sometimes need help. Anyway, it's same as with the Christians that hint their versions, biblical interpretation, and a baptism is necessary to be saved. Sure, again, I've been listening to this new series on, I think it's on PBS, called The Pope, and it's very interesting to hear how the papacy developed over the 2,000-year period. Very interesting indeed. And those guys were definitely not lily white, even though they wore white cassocks, and I know that my ancestry is here. I'm living here in Maryland because the Catholics were very intolerant of the Calvinists. And about halfway through the 80 Years' War, my first American ancestor picked up stakes from Holland, from Netherlands, and came to New York And he and his wife and three sons. The five of them were five of the first 150 settlers of Manhattan Island. So that's how early my ancestry decided to get away from the Catholic Church. But, I can say honestly, now some of my best friends are Catholics, and some of my best friends are Jews also. So, but we change, and we need to change, and we need for everyone in the world to start changing. And I think it's a process that we've been doing in the U.S. But I do want to get through these 9 points of Dr. Edinger, so I'm going to move on. Right. Gray, I agree with you that he has not read the Edinger stuff, and he probably read the first few paragraphs and said, well, this isn't for me. Yeah, I think that that's true. You do need to talk about it. And so, I run a group on Facebook called the Rabbi, the Novelist, the Umpty Frats, and the Marine. I'm the Marine of the group of five. One of them's the Revolutionary, and so on. And let's see, that's a closed group, but I think if you're here, you're welcome to join. So let me see if I can find that. I get a link to it anyway. Okay, so you can ask to join this if you like. It didn't work for some reason. Try it again, it says. Facebook doesn't like that. So I'll just give you the name of it, and you can find it on Facebook and then ask to join because it's a private group. What's the full name of it? Okay. So the headline of it is The Rabbi, the Novelist, the Dreamer, the Revolutionary, and the Marine walked into a bar. And this is what we were talking about. And what seems to happen there, and it happens with my rabbi friend, and it happens with me to a certain degree. I acknowledge we tend to talk past each other. He does a lot of publishing about Jewish issues, and he is still has a congregation now in Sanibel Island, Florida. And so I publish my Jungian pieces, and he publishes his Jewish pieces. And I do try to read what he writes. And I only get set off when he starts talking about the chosen. Most of the time, I like what he writes very much, as evidenced by the fact that I republished his book on that website. So Grace says, I have no social media but YouTube. I deleted my Facebook in 2010. I have to sneak on to your Twitter to know when you might be coming on. Okay, well, I'll try to keep it regular to this Thursday at 1:30 period. But otherwise, next Monday I'm going to start doing the group at the pizza restaurant again because I basically lost my local group when I had to have my surgery. And so I'm hopeful that it will reform now that I'm basically recovered. And so at least this Monday I won't be broadcasting, but I will be broadcasting intermittently behind the scenes on some of my readings. In other words, as I do readings for the YouTube channel, I will go online and live stream at that time. And so if you have questions when you see me on live stream, you're welcome to ask them. I'll keep my reading going, but every 5 or 10 minutes I'll stop and take a look at what people are saying and see if there are questions. So anyway, let's go on with these points. So point 2, what does Job have that God does not have? Job has a keener consciousness based on self-reflection. I think what inflamed the theologian approach to answer to Job was that Dr. Jung said Yahweh wasn't very conscious, and part of his point was it's not very conscious to spend several hundred million years in evolving beings that can consciously look out into the universe and consciously be aware of ourselves and all other creatures around us, and be able to do things like recognize that asteroids are coming toward the Earth and they might cause extinction. And so we can do something about them. We can actually fire a rocket into space and maybe move an asteroid or something like that. That takes consciousness. We're the only species that can do that. And it took hundreds of millions of years, maybe billions of years, honestly, to evolve that capacity. And so anyway, Dr. Jung's observation is that we have this keener consciousness. And so he says God, Dr. Jung called Yahweh's consciousness double-faced behavior, like in the Garden of Eden too, where he puts Adam and Eve in the garden and then introduces the snake, because if God didn't create the heavens and the earth, or if he did, then the snake came from him. And so he says God has no need of circumspection, for nowhere does he come up against an insuperable obstacle that would force him to hesitate, and hence make him reflect on himself. So human beings, that's what happens to us when we have a defeat, is that we have to reflect on ourselves. And we experience weakness and defeat, and that's a necessary condition for consciousness. That's how we have consciousness. And the infantile psyche is in a state of identification with the self, and it is in a state of inflation. It is identified with the deity. So this is why I say all children think they're little gods and goddesses. Very progressively, if life provides the right lessons through rejections and defeats and experiences of weakness, we gradually become conscious, and we have to cycle through this process again and again. And example would be, so we need contest, defeat, lamentation, revelation. I gave the example of Florence Foster Jenkins. I don't know if you know of that movie that Meryl Streep played in. But it's a very interesting movie because it's a movie in which this very wealthy woman was never denied. She got everything she wanted, and she thought she could be a opera singer. And she would organize a party at the Waldorf Astoria every year, and she would sing, and everybody would put the earplugs in their ears when she was singing, or they'd find that time to go to the restroom or something. But so she pushed it more and more, and nobody said no to her because she was giving a lot of money to the Met. And so they just let her run, and she had this belief that she was this great opera singer, and she wanted to have a opening at Carnegie Hall, and so she did. And her husband hired the hall for a night, and nobody bought tickets, so he gave 3,000 tickets away to soldiers, sailors, and Marines coming back from World War II. And that was not a good result for her. And so it's ironic now, because partially because of the movie, but even before the movie came out, her record became the most popular record sold from the gift shop of the Met. Because everybody knows about it. Everybody wants to hear this record. And but she never had anyone say no to her. And so she developed much farther than probably she would have or should have. And we can point to at least one individual that's very much like that today. I'm not going to get into it, but anyway. So it's a real disadvantage to be omnipotent and to be immortal. In fact, as far as I can tell, consciousness can only develop in mortal creatures. In other words, the archetypes themselves cannot evolve into full consciousness without being routed through a mortal ego to bring that consciousness into realization. So, why does God need man? God needs man to have consciousness and to be conscious of the consummate beauty and enormity of God's creation, very simply. And so, anyway, so Yahweh makes Job's life a living hell. That's in paragraphs 580 to 582. And his family and friends abandon him or torment him. And Yahweh displays no compassion whatsoever. And then Edinger's point 3 then is, let's see, are you seeing point 3 on the screen? I'm having a hard time reading it because I have a smaller version. I think so. Okay, so Job's suffering ends, but it's not clear why. From the point of view of the psyche, a compensation emerges. In other words, the universe is in balance. You can't just keep beating up on somebody forever. Eventually, something's going to come back to get you. In Buddhism and Hinduism, this is called karma. So Edinger says, what Jung is alluding to here is the profound psychological law that when the ego becomes too one-sided, weighted too much in one direction, the unconscious psyche then constellates the contrary in the unconscious to balance the one-sidedness. Injustice consciously perceived and born constellates justice. This is a quite fundamental psychological law, and I know from my own life that karma is perfect, and so I know if somebody has done something nasty to me, I have absolutely no need to do anything because somehow they get whacked in the side of the head every time. It never fails. So I just stand back and let it happen. And knowing that it will happen, and it happens every time. So the Emerson quote is, thus is the universe alive. All things are moral. Justice is not postponed. A perfect equity adjusts its balance in all parts of life. Every secret is told. Every crime is punished. Every virtue is rewarded. Every wrong redressed in silence and certainty. What we call retribution is the universal necessity by which the whole appears wherever a part appears. And so the universe and our psyches have wholeness, and if it becomes imbalanced, it finds balance. So then he goes on to say, beware of too much good staying in your hand. It will fast corrupt and breed worms. Pay it away quickly. In other words, you know, I think we have a big enough example of this in the United States right now, and I'm not even going to get into it, but you can see it very clearly, and you're going to see the results of it very clearly too very soon. How will we handicap bet on whether? Oh no, I'm not going to say that because that's the part I wasn't going to say. But anyway, we can all realize this consciously or unconsciously. Consider Job's situation in the context of the popularity of Joni Mitchell's lament in Both Sides Now. The last two stanzas go like this. But now old friends are acting strange. They shake their heads, they say I've changed. Well, something's lost and something's gained in living every day. I've looked at life from both sides now, from win and lose, and still somehow it's life's illusions I recall. I really don't know life at all. I've looked at life from both sides now, from up and down, and still somehow it's life's illusions I recall. I really don't know life at all. And so I think we could say that at least those of us that are on this discussion or watching the video afterward, we all know this in our hearts, that what Joni Mitchell had in that song was just right. So anyway, point 4. Job's great insight is that he realizes God's inner antinomy, and in light of this realization, his knowledge attains a divine numinosity. And so what antinomy means is that he realizes that God has a good side and a bad side. And so when he addresses himself to Yahweh in terms of the justice that he needs, he goes to the good side of God, or he addresses himself to the good side of God, the just judge. And so it's Edinger's point from paragraph 584 that Yahweh has backed away from the bet with Satan because of this, that Job has made him face his own morality, made Yahweh, which in psychological terms we're talking about the self. So what I say, if we cannot read Joni Mitchell's lyrics without tears coming to our eyes, then we have known the numinosity to which Jung and Edinger refer. Well, they often cause me to tear up when I'm listening to her singing, and even when I just say them, I can feel emotion welling up in me, even though I have talked about this at length. So not only in this call, but in everything that I've done in the last couple of years. So it shouldn't be that numinous for me, but it still is. It still is. This is where my feeling function, my emotion kicks in. To me, these lyrics contain that certain je ne sais quoi that connects me to the divine. It's ineffable, indescribable, but it is there nonetheless. And this is coming from a very T Marine. You know, I served 23 years in the Marines, but nonetheless, I feel it very much so. So it means that Job has become a partner in Yahweh's divinity, just as a mother realizes the baby's wholeness and therefore doesn't get after it for behaving like Yahweh. It's an experience of the conjunctio, which is there's a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis. And that's an important concept. So Yahweh is good, Yahweh is bad, Yahweh is all. And this is an important idea in Jungian psychology. I was the other day reading the letter to Père William Lachot, which I'm just uploading as we're talking. I don't know if it's finished yet on the site, but in that, Dr. Jung is talking about the God of the Old Testament being the Father, the God of the New Testament being the Son, and the Holy Ghost being the third person. And that Holy Ghost was intended even by Christ to be all of us, to that aspect of divinity to enter into us. And in writing his letter to Père Lachot, Dr. Jung sort of chastised the Archbishop of New York. I think his name was Dr. Temple, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, he was at a dinner with the Archbishop of New York, and the Archbishop of New York admitted that the church hadn't bothered to develop the idea of the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost very much. And certainly in Protestant churches, we get lip service to the Holy Ghost, but I don't ever recall at least a Calvinist Protestant preacher, which is the type of Christianity I've followed in my lifetime mostly. I never remember a pastor telling us that that the divinity is in you and it comes to you through the Holy Ghost, which is what Jesus was saying. Jesus said, I have to leave, I have to be gone, so that the Holy Ghost can be born in everyone. And obviously the Holy Ghost was developed in all of his followers, because we wouldn't even know that this man Jesus exists but for the fact that his spirit lives on, and we wouldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for the fact that Dr. Jung's spirit lives on in some way. So he's guiding us to understand the synthesis in religion, and that synthesis is us. We are the conjunctio, we are the vessel in which the antinomy of God can find conjunctio, can find conjunction, and therefore wholeness. This is the fundamental point. Let's see. So Edinger says he's justified through his awareness that his experience is part of the ego-self partnership, which provides him, Job, with a role in the divine drama. So Dr. Edinger is saying that Job realized that this is something going on with him and that he has a role in it. And it seems to me that if we all think of ourselves as being a part of the divine drama, that makes us think of ourselves in a more mature manner, I think. So in paragraph 585, Dr. Edinger says, who is darkening what counsel? The only dark thing here is how Yahweh ever came to make a bet with Satan, unless, of course, it was Yahweh himself who egged Satan on for the ultimate purpose of exalting Job. So in other words, Dr. Edinger is saying, if Yahweh is whole, then perhaps he was trying to bring up Job as an exalted individual, and the only way he could do it was by this ruse of this bet with Satan. So it seems like a hard way to learn, but anyway, that's what he says. So anyway, Yahweh could have foreseen the result from his omniscience, and Dr. Jung thinks that's improbable, that he didn't have enough consciousness to do it at that time. And so, let's see. Yeah, so Miles, I concur. Karma, you should let it do the dirty work for you, because it will. I mean, because if someone is arrogant with you, for example, they're also going to be arrogant with someone who's carrying a gun someday or something like that. And so they're going to get the result. And Gray, I do agree that this is the way of what is to come, that the way of what is to come is going to come through us. And one of the big points that Dr. Jung, or later Drs. Hillman and Shamdasani, commented when they were going around talking about the Red Book, and they did 15 lectures around the country, which was the recordings of which were turned into a book called Lament of the Dead, and it's by Hillman and Shamdasani. It's a good book, but what he says, what they say is that there's a lot of blood in the Red Book, and the reason there is that it's only by blood that we really learn. And if we look at just the Parkland school shooting recently, I mean, everybody in the United States was pretty complacent about gun violence, and we still are. There's no doubt we haven't had enough yet. But, you know, we have 350 million guns. Why do we need so many guns? I mean, I have a high school classmate who claims he has 50 guns, and I say, well, you know, you can only use one at a time, and if the government wants to take your guns or wants to do something about you, they're going to come with a tank or a F-18. How does your gun help you with the government? And but he won't hear it. He can't hear it, and he's just off in his own little space. I mean, he publishes about 30 to 50 memes per day on Facebook, and almost all of them, a very large percentage of them, are about guns and keeping guns and support of the NRA. And so he's not going to change. He's been doing this for at least 15 years, to which I can testify. Or maybe it's not 15, but it's ever since Facebook got going anyway. And he's not going to change until there's enough blood. But we do see others of our fellow citizens that are changing right before our eyes, and it's the blood of those 17 children who were killed 6 weeks ago that's causing that change. And obviously, the demonstrations that we saw on the 24th of March are evidence of that. The blood of those 17 children was really what got 800 demonstrations going around the world. And so it's actually the clash of the human psyche that causes change. I mean, the Germans weren't going to change until, as Dr. Jung puts it, evil has to be burned out root and branch. And so the Nazis were not going to change until all the crockery was broken. The same with the Japanese. I mean, I happen to know about the Japanese because I went to Japan when I was 15 years old in 1962, only 17 years after the war. And they were planning to have 15-year-old girls on the beaches armed with sharpened bamboo poles to defend the homeland against the American invasion that would have had to be done if there hadn't been an atomic attack. And so, when evil gets control and causes a psychic epidemic like that in a society, it cannot be removed until it is removed root and branch entirely. And so, we see many examples of that in our society too. And we see echoes of fights that have been going on among Americans for at least a couple of centuries very clearly. And in fact, the founding fathers referred to slavery as the wolf because they knew eventually that slavery would have to be abolished. It was, when the United States was founded, it was already under heavy attack in the British Parliament, and it was abolished in Britain, I think, in 1798 or something like that. And it took the United States another 65 years to abolish slavery. But the founding fathers of the United States knew that that was going to be a huge problem, the wolf in American society, for a long time. And I don't think they appreciated just how bad it would be, but nonetheless. And so that is the way of what is to come. Carl Jung Depth Psychology, I know who that is. Welcome. All steps forward in the improvement of the human psyche have been paid for by blood, absolutely. And thank you for that reference. Vincent Van Flo, does Jung have any writing on sun and moon symbolism? Yes, he certainly does. And what I would recommend is that there's a WordPress site called Carl Jung Depth Psychology, and also a Facebook page called Carl Jung Depth Psychology. That is operated, both of those are operated by the same person who is now responding to you or to us on this chat. And so I would urge you to go take a look at those pages. I'm going to allow him to keep his anonymity unless he wishes to reveal himself. But in any case, he has maintained a huge archive of Jungian quotes and Jungian references for nearly 20 years now that I know of, and I can't really speak. Maybe he wants to speak for how long he's been doing it. But when I began following the Carl Jung Depth Psychology page on Facebook, it had about 4,000 members, and that was in about 2005. The membership now is over 62,000. So there's obviously a great interest in Dr. Jung's work, and a lot of it has to do with his work. And he's just started a YouTube channel called Carl Jung Depth Psychology, where he's putting a lot of videos of memes up with quotes for many of these things. So if you want, if Carl Jung Depth Psychology wants to give us a reference while this video is going on, I'd welcome it. Anyway, Vincent, to give you the final answer, I don't have a reference right now, but if you send me your email address to skip.conover@gmail.com, I can add you to our Dropbox, and in the Dropbox you can find volume 20 of Dr. Jung's collected works, and in that you can do a search for Sun and Moon, and I'm sure you'll find a lot. Clark says, I love the movie Gone with the Wind. I think it gets at the wolf, which was so genteel culture. Yes, and obviously so genteel culture is still an enemy in many ways. You see that it permeates the PBS series on the Kennedys, for example, and many others. So that's a good quote. As the eye to the sun, so the soul corresponds to God. And that's Collected Works 12, paragraph 11. Now I want to go on with this. So point 5, Job is no more than the outward occasion for an inward process of dialectic in God. And so in psychological terms, the ego is the outward occasion for an inward process of dialectic in the self. This is a realization of the partnership. And so Dr. Edinger was very big on this ego-self axis and the fact that we all need to have a living relationship with that axis. And so he says this realization communicates a sense of meaningfulness because the painful experience that one is going through is purposeful. It is part of a larger transpersonal process, transpersonal being the collective unconscious. It requires an ego for that process to proceed. So then he says regarding paragraph 588, Job had noticed during this harangue, 71 verses, that everything else had been mentioned except his right. Yahweh is more concerned with his own affairs. Satan has somehow to disappear, best done by casting suspicion on Job as a man of subversive opinions. Yahweh's unassailable power, but is doing damage to his own omniscience by behaving like this. Job has no alternative but to withdraw his demand for justice. I lay my hand across my mouth, as he said. So, let's see. In 589, Job has succumbed to the tremendous force of the divine demonstration when mommy changes the diapers after an outburst of infantile rage. Paragraph 590, Yahweh is not seeing Job at all. He's dealing with Satan in his own house. And then he says, gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare me. Job 38:3 and 47. So then we get to point 6, which comes in paragraphs 591 to 593. Yahweh self sees in Job ego and equal power. So here Yahweh represents the self and Job represents the ego. And Yahweh is seeing, the self is seeing that ego can be an equal power. And so, quote, Yahweh projects onto Job a skeptic's face which is hateful to him because it is his own, and which gazes at him with an uncanny and critical eye. He is afraid of it, for only in face of something frightening does one let off a cannonade of references to one's power, cleverness, courage, invincibility, etc. And so the point is that the self is seeing that the ego can make moral decisions, and maybe he wasn't making moral decisions per se before that. He made the laws, okay, he made the 10 Commandments, but he's realizing that the ego is part of him. It's not a separate thing. Okay, so 594, Job is challenged as though he himself were a god. But at this point in time, there is no other god but Satan, who Yahweh must hide from himself. Because of his close kinship as son, he must be concealed with utmost discretion, even to the point of God hiding him from his own consciousness in his own bosom. In his stead, God must set up his miserable servant as the bugbear, which is an imaginary figure used to frighten children, who he has to fight in the hope that by banishing the dreaded countenance to the hidden place, he will be able to maintain himself in a state of unconsciousness. So then we get to paragraph 595.7. We are the incarnation of God. There is no God out there who created heaven. We must each do our moral and ethical bit to be the incarnation of God. This is Edinger's point. Quote, the conflict becomes acute for Yahweh as a result of a new factor, which is, however, not hidden from omniscience. A mortal man is raised by his moral behavior above the stars in heaven, from which position of advantage he can behold the back of Yahweh, the abysmal world of shards. And of course, that's the very powerful image that comes up in the Blake images, which I can show you briefly here again. Where Yahweh is now showing Job his backside, which is, it took him hundreds of millions of years and lots of begetting and devouring before he created a creature that was conscious in the form of Job. And that's what this image is about in the Blake images, which you can find that complete discussion in Edinger's Portable Analytic Hour, which I've put on the site. Now let's see. I'll go back here for a minute. So Satan is only mentioned like 3 times in the Old Testament. For Jews, Satan meant the opposer. I'm not sure I can give an interpretation, a Jewish interpretation of Satan. But what the point that Dr. Jung makes is that Christ saw Satan fall out of heaven. And so Satan doesn't ever get out of heaven until the New Testament. And so in the entire Old Testament, Satan is still in the heavenly court with God. So then I suppose he's the opposer in the heavenly court. And I've been taken to task a couple of times. Let me see if I can get a better picture of myself here. He's been taken to task. I've been taken to task a couple of times because fundamentalists say, "What do you mean that Satan is the older son of God?" And I just say, "Have you read Genesis?" Christ didn't come along until the birth of Christ, which was 2,000 years ago, but Genesis happened much before that, thousands of years before that. So Satan was definitely there. And so our modern perspective is to look back at the Satan as devil-type figure, which I think hinders us. Yes, of course it does. And this is the point of individuation that Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger are trying to get at. I mean, they were both asked, how do you individuate? Well, the answer is you reflect on what you love and hate, and particularly what you hate. And, Miles gave us the reference to the questions about the truth of the 9/11 events a few days ago. And what we all need to reflect upon is how we, through our action or inaction, may have contributed to that. Okay, I mean, that would be a step toward individuation. And certainly since election 2016, I've had to evaluate, and I have been evaluating, I continue to evaluate what is it that I've done in my lifetime that has contributed to what we now see in American politics, and in world politics too, for that matter. And I've had to admit that yes, I'm guilty. I did a lot of international work. I made 44 trips to India between 1994 and 2013, and I've made 23 trips to Saudi Arabia. And so in some sense, some of those issues I have to admit that I contributed to, and then I have to evaluate those from my own point of view and help me understand what I need to do to change the world in the future. And so looking at this story as a dialectic is more correct or traditional than what later Christians would make of it. I think most Christians don't even think about it. I certainly myself never paid much attention to the book of Job, and I don't remember any of my Christian pastors ever talking about it. And I think a lot of people simply don't understand it, and so they avoid it. And that's why I think it's really fascinating to read what Dr. Jung has said in it. Satan, unlike Christ, was created, not begotten. When I create, I am free and not dependent. I take that to mean that this is in the Carl Jung, the Jung-Ostrowski letters on page 48, that link. And so, yeah, I mean, Satan was a created thing. That's true. And so let's go on here. The conflict between becomes acute for Yahweh as a result of a new fact. Okay, so the conflict becomes acute for Yahweh as a result of a new factor, which is, however, not hidden from omniscience. A mortal man is raised by his moral behavior above the stars in heaven, from which position of advantage he can behold the back of Yahweh, the abysmal world of shards, which shards, representing the forces of evil and darkness, had spilled out into life. The primordial light was poured into 10 vessels, the Sephiroth. The first 3 held the light, but the lower 7 could not endure the pressure of the light poured into them, and they broke. That was the shards. Okay, so Edinger says it's a symbolic image. One of its features is that as the Godhead manifests itself from a point of light, as it emanates and tries to differentiate itself, it splits. It undergoes a separation process, and part of it breaks up into an evil world, the abysmal world of shards. I guess I've projected my own analysis on it a bit, and for that I apologize. Okay, so paragraph 596, Job knows Yahweh's secret, but is smart enough to keep it. I know that thou canst do all things, and that no purpose of thine can be thwarted. So that's what Job said. So anyway, carrying on here. Paragraph 597, Job acknowledges that Yahweh can do as he likes, both good and evil. He can boast of his superior power and enact laws which mean less than air to him. I guess I need to pull this down a little bit so that you can see it. So then he says, so you've lost your sons and daughters? No harm done. I'll give you new and better ones. So in paragraph 598, Job acknowledges his weakness in the face of ruthless Yahweh. I had heard of thee in the hearing of my ear, but now I see. Now my eye sees thee. Paragraph 599, Job prostrates himself as defeated. He's got a taste of his reality, more so even than David. So anyway, before he was naive, dreaming of a good God or a benevolent ruler and just judge, he had imagined a covenant as a legal matter that assured rights as agreed. But to his horror, he has discovered Yahweh is not human. And so anyway, all right, so point 8, the unconscious has an animal nature. The unconscious has an animal nature, behavior of an unconscious being that can't be judged morally. And this is the point of the Ezekiel vision, which comes out and it shows God that is 3/4 animal and only 1/4 human. And Edinger points out at page 51 of his book, and we're talking in his book about this one, which is The Transformation of the God Image by Edward Edinger. And this is his 10 lectures on Answer to Job. It's very worth the money anyway. And it's published by Inner City Books, I believe. Yes, by Inner City Books. So, so what Job has realized is that Yahweh is a phenomenon. He's not a man. And there's a remarkable footnote 13, the naive assumption that the creator of the world is a conscious being must be regarded as a disastrous prejudice, which later gave rise to the most incredible dislocations of logic. And of course we see that every Saturday in the fall when football players run across the goal line and they point up. And they shouldn't be pointing up, they should be pointing at their heart, because the power that God gives you doesn't come from up there, it comes from in here. So Jung goes on to say in this footnote that when we understand that what we are dealing with is divine unconscious and lack of reflection, then we are enabled to form a conception of God which puts his actions beyond moral judgment and allows no conflict to arise between goodliness and beastliness. And so the point is that our self, our nature, is part of the 2 million-year-old man, as Dr. Jung described it. And you got your edition of that on the day that you were born. It hasn't evolved any further after you were born. And so then it's up to you, through your maturity, to evolve the idea of right and wrong. And goodness only comes from our heart. So anyway, okay. So what Jung is describing here is the nature of the unconscious. This is not metaphysical theology, but he is indulging in it. It is empirical psychology. Jung is describing what he knows from his own experience. So the whole of Answer to Job is put in a metaphorical context. Because why? Because the last 2,000 years has all these ideas mixed into it, as Gray Yates rightfully pointed out earlier. And it's very complex. We don't have any idea where certain ideas that we come to the world with came from. They could have come up from a pope in the 7th century for all we know. But they come to us unconsciously. And so the way we go about thinking and so on comes from that development over many years. And what Drs. Jung and Edinger are talking about in the self is something that they can prove scientifically from the science of depth psychology. And this is a science that does not follow the scientific method, because let's remember that the scientific method usually solves for X. In other words, it holds all other aspects constant and solves for one variable. But in depth psychology, you have to deal with the whole person. And so Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger after him and many others had to completely develop this new science of depth psychology. And that's what they did. So let's see. So Carl Jung depth psychology says, whoops, getting ahead of me a little bit here. The devil is the adversary, is your own other standpoint. He tempts you and sets a stone in your path where you least want it. That's definitely true. And, I'm just recovering from my ankle replacement where 28 years ago, my other standpoint caused me to slip on the ice at Marine Corps Base Quantico, and that ended my Marine Corps career. My other standpoint didn't want me to be a Marine anymore, so that was the last thing I did in uniform, was I broke my leg. And I did it in a very uncourageous manner. I was simply walking across a parking lot, and all of a sudden I was down and my foot was not on my leg anymore. And that was quite a shocking moment. I was 43 years old, and so that's what your other standpoint will do for you, and what mythologically is called later the Amfortas wound, which comes up in the Grail legend. Um, anyway, so Yahweh and Allah are unreflected God images, whereas in the Clementine homilies, there is a psychological and reflective spirit at work. Okay, I don't know much about that, so I have nothing really to say on that point. I do. I don't know about the Clementine homilies. I do agree that Yahweh and Allah are unreflected God images, and that's one of the reasons that Muslims get so upset when somebody wants to make an image of Allah and or the Prophet, peace be upon him. So we have to know that this is the standpoint from which they take the world, and they don't reflect on it. Let's see. Yeah, I was trying to point to my heart. Unfortunately, I only have a little space on this screen at the moment because I'm showing you my notes. Clark says, so one of the big philosophical questions in Western tradition is man is essentially good, but in the East it relations to man being God. Atma as Brahma. Yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, in Buddhism, which is, sometimes we quip and say that Buddhism is not a religion. There's no God, there's no heaven, there's no hell, there are no apostles, there's no right, there's no wrong, etc., 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 and you can go right down this catechism. And so Buddhism is only about self-reflection, actually, when you get right down to it. And I think that Buddhists would regard enlightenment as the same as what Dr. Edinger calls the conjunctio, which is only achievable, as Dr. Edinger says, at the time of death, in that all the opposites are conjoined at that point, and there's no more fighting between the two sides. So there was a message held for review. I guess this was this message. I guess I can show it. Go to bed, think of the problem, see what you dream. Perhaps the great man, the 2 million-year-old man, will speak in a cul-de-sac. Then only do you hear his voice, said Jung. I don't know why that comment was held for review, but it was, so I've cleared that. But that's definitely a way to communicate with the self, is to ask a question right before you go to sleep and then see what your dreams or visions are. That's how you can have this ego self axis in real life. And have input from the self. So anyway, so as to paragraph 601, Dr. Edinger says the therapeutic measure of unresisting acceptance had proved its value yet again. This shows Dr. Jung was analyzing Job's story from a psychological point of view, something few theologians grokked. Few theologians got that, I guess we'd say the Bible and actually all religious texts are come from this axis. And as Dr. Jung says quite explicitly later at paragraph 752, all religious statements of whatever kind are statements of the psyche. They are not statements of the physical world, and he says that if that were not so, then they would be contained in the textbooks of natural science. And he's quite right about that. And when I read that the first time, quite a few years ago now, I went, oh my God, that's one of the, that was an epiphany for me. The West is always seeking uplift, but the East seeks a sinking or deepening. Yeah, I think that that's true. And the dichotomy that Dr. Edinger talks about is Jesus and Buddha, and Jesus being on the ego end of the spectrum and the Buddha being on the self end. And so the self is all about contemplation. And I remember when I was 15 and I went to the great Buddha of Kamakura in Japan for the first time. It was a mile from my house, so I've been to it many times since then. But I always looked up at it and said, what is this guy thinking or doing? And, it turned out later as I was looking at it that he was meditating. Okay, so anyway, going on, paragraph 602, the protagonists back away. 603, from our modern point of view, we don't have an answer to the satanic prank. Job, and I'm quoting here from Edinger, I believe, Job has not so much answered as reacted in an adjusted way, and an adaptation is, I think, the way the psychotherapist would talk about it. In so doing, he displayed remarkable self-discipline, but an unequivocal answer has still to be given. Okay, there's still no answer. And keeping in mind, this is 500 years before Christ, so Yahweh is going to stay an amoral force of nature for at least 500 more years. And so what about the moral wrong Job has suffered? Yahweh needs Job's loyalty. He attaches almost divine importance to man. He's treating Job almost as a god. What do you give someone who has everything? Praise. Yahweh reacts irritably to every word that has the faintest suggestion of criticism, while he himself does not care a straw for his own moral code if his actions happen to run counter to its statutes. So, anyway, point 9. Let's see here. Okay, point 9. Job did get his satisfaction. This is, quote, "This is I, the creator of all the ungovernable, ruthless forces of nature, which are not subject to any ethical laws. I, too, am an amoral force of nature, a purely phenomenal personality that cannot see its own back." So, in spite of his impotence, Job, the man, is set up as a judge over God himself. Edinger at page 52, again, we're talking about this book, Transformation of the God Image. It is a symbolic description of the dawning of a transpersonal dimension of consciousness that has the power of redemption. It demonstrates what we previously said, that God's ethics come from man's conscience. And so, instead of, everybody's been taught to do this child's prayer of, oh God, please give me this or that for Christmas type thing. And, the reality is we need to grow up. So in paragraph 607, the poet ends the story when Job prostrates himself. A relativization of God is utterly unthinkable at that time and remains so for the next 2,000 years. It's actually 2,500 years because I don't think we've achieved it even now. Paragraph 607 or 608. I say that because this pointing up instead of in the heart, we still haven't understood that it is us that makes God's world happen. And until we do accept that, we haven't matured to the psychological level that Drs. Edinger and Jung were pointing to. So 608, the unconscious mind of man sees correctly even when conscious reason is blind and impotent. Yahweh's dual nature has been revealed, and somebody or something has registered this fact. Such a revelation, whether it reached man's consciousness or not, could not fail to have far-reaching consequences. And it comes to full consciousness in the work of Dr. Jung. This is what Edinger is saying. Let's see, how much farther does this go? Okay, let me, very briefly. So, in another of his books, The Creation of Consciousness by Edward Edinger, again by Inner City Books, he says, in my opinion, Answer to Job has the same psychic depth and import as characterize the major scriptures of the world religions. There's a tremendous change in the God image. Quoting Dr. Jung on page 61, he says, I am not addressing myself to the happy possessors of faith, but to those many people for whom the light has gone out, the mystery has faded, and God is dead. For most of them there is no going back, and one does not know either whether going back is a better way. To gain an understanding of religious matters, probably all that is left to us today is the psychological approach. That is why I take these thought forms that have become historically fixed and try to melt them down again and pour them into molds of immediate experience. Now, Edinger says the psychological approach to religious imagery is not available at any depth to one who is contained in a particular religious myth. Again, quoting Jung, he says, I do not write for believers who already possess the whole truth, rather for the unbelieving but intelligent people who want to understand something. Without the psyche, you can neither know nor believe. Therefore, everything about which we can speak at all lies in the psychic realm. Even the atom is, in a sense, a psychic model. One might inscribe inside the check of this book, nothing here for the believing Christian. Again, that was a reading from the letter to Bernhard Martin that I read at the beginning of this session. So I'll go back to your questions and we will continue on next time. But so Carl Jung Depth Psychology says, if there is anything like the spirit seizing one by the scruff of the neck, it was the way this book, Answer to Job, came into being. Yeah, definitely. Dr. Jung always said that his writings were when he had no choice, when he was forced to write. And that has certainly been my experience. I think it's the experience of my friend from Carl Jung Depth Psychology YouTube channel who has been moved by his self to publish Dr. Jung's work for many years, and obviously the fact that I'm doing this channel and this series of discussions is something that's coming from my deep self. It's not something that comes directly from my ego per se. I'm in effect directed by the self to produce this YouTube channel, and I thank you all for participating. Now, let me just mention we managed to catch up to where we were, and so I managed to get through everything that I promised up to through paragraph 608. So next week in session 6, I will address paragraphs 609 to 624, which are about Sophia and wisdom and the feminine principle, all issues that you will probably find interesting. And so thank you for joining me today. I think we need to drop off pretty quick, but Carl Jung Depth Psychology says, as an example of synchronicity, Dr. Jung points to the publication of Answer to Job and on synchronicity occurring at the same time. That's very interesting, and I have synchronicities happen to me every day, and we can talk about synchronicity another time. That's probably a Q&A that I need to do at some point, but it's a very complex idea, if there's anything like that. Let's see. So thanks, everyone, for joining me. Because these videos get extremely long, I need to cut off within the 2-hour time frame. So I am going to do that at this point, but I will schedule another session on paragraphs 609 to 624 for next Thursday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Thank you for being here, and thank you especially to my friend from Carl Jung Depth Psychology channel for joining us today and providing those great references that you did provide. I appreciate that very much. And thank you, Gray and Miles, for being here too. Definitely.